Assalamu alaikum. Welcome to Muslims for Progressive Values. I'm your host, Kendra Cordova, and today we're going to get an introduction into a progressive interpretation of the story of Lut. However, this is only the first video in what is going to be a pretty extensive series on queer Muslims, their experiences, history of, and place within Islam. We're going to be taking a look at a lot of different kinds of courses and lessons from people like MPV's own course on LGBTQ intersections in Islam, and that was put together by Afnan El-Maghrabi. She is a licensed marriage and family therapist, so she goes through for Islamic leaders, imams, people like that, how they can counsel and connect with and better understand their queer Muslim community. We're also going to be taking a look at a chapter-by-chapter breakdown of Dr. Scott Kuggle's Homosexuality in Islam, Critical Reflection on Gay, Lesbian, and Transgender Muslims. So it's a pretty hefty book. We are going to get through that one. We're also going to get through Dr. Ludovic-Muhamed Zahed's book on homosexuality, transidentity, and Islam, a study of scripture confronting the politics of gender and sexuality. We're also going to look at stories and experiences from gay Muslims around the world, trans Muslims from around the world, and one of those we're going to highlight is going to be MPV's, one of our advisors here, Daayiee Abdullah's Progressive Islam. He is one of the first openly gay imams in the world, so we are going to hear about his experience as well as many others as well. So we have a lot to cover, but before we can even touch on that, we need to have a starting point, and we're going to start that today with understanding what is the progressive view or the progressive interpretation on homosexuality in Islam, specifically of the story of Lut. So we're going to take a look at what it actually says, how progressive Muslims interpret what it says, how we get to that point, and what we can do going forth today. My first encounter with Lut and the story of Lut was a little like question mark here, right? Like that, wait a minute. This happens a lot. Muslims will convert to Islam because it's so progressive, like I talked about in previous videos, talking about social justice, rights for women, all of these wonderful things. And then there are some times where you'll run into a verse or two where you question for a second, you're like, wait a minute. This is one of those. There are also examples of things like Surah 4, verse 34, which to non-Muslims and people that don't contextualize the Quran, they think that this could be talking about wife beating, right? Or it's called like the wife beating verse. Or also ones like Surah 9, verse 5, which is also known as the sword verse. This verse can also come up with some issues if it's misinterpreted or it's not given its proper context. Good news is when you talk to Muslims nowadays, the first thing that they're going to want to say is, wait, you need context for that, right? Like, we can't just take it word for word literally. We need to look at what the situation was going on at the time. What is this referring to? How can we translate that into what we experience today? And for that, I just have to say, good, yes, exactly. The Quran requires context because not only is it a 1400-year-old document, but just like in some of the previous videos I talked about, if you haven't seen the one on a progressive mindset for Muslims, definitely go see it. But that one really breaks down that some of the things in the Quran are for the people of the time. And then as humans sort of grow and learn more about the universe and therefore learn more about God, it's not really going to apply anymore. A good example of that is going to be the ones that have to do with slavery, right? Like, we have outgrown that at this point. There's no reason to return to it simply because there isn't a line in the Quran that says that, all slavery is wrong. We have moved past all of that. We know that now, and there's no reason to try to return to something like that because all of those verses were specific to that time period and the people that were there at the time. But yes, this makes sense that we need to understand historical context, and nowadays that we have psychology, biological, social, and global information that we didn't have previously, we can now go back and look at some of these verses and try to reinterpret to make sense in our world today. When I came across some of these verses here, like Surah 7 verse 80 or Surah 15 verses 67 through 70, I had that little question mark like I do, but I have a background in textual analysis, literary analysis, thematic reading. I have my master's degree specifically in creative writing. I teach composition and rhetoric. I am College Board certified for AP language. So being able to understand stories, themes, subplots, symbolism, and then also just being able to take apart language and understand what they were trying to say or what was being said at the time, contextualizing it within a larger text. These are all things that I was like, I know how to do this. Let's try to figure this out. We're going to do this by reading the verses, breaking them down. We're going to be comparing them to the text overall of the Quran, and then we're going to put them into context of the time, finally finding out how it might pertain to the world today. Those are our steps. Let's do it together. So, what does the Quran actually say about homosexuality? First of all, it doesn't say homosexuality because that's a modern term, right? There was really no concept of these different terms, of these different psychologies here and experiences of people. And it doesn't actually have that many verses in the Quran that even talk about the story of Lut. But since there isn't a lot of information, we're going to have to use a supplemental text. So I went ahead and grabbed my copy of Stories of the Prophets. So this is the piece that was done by Imam Ibn Kathir. It goes over the stories of the prophets like it says, and really just puts it into like, here's what was actually going on in the story of that prophet, and then let's now take these Quranic verses and sort of compare here. The first one I wanted to talk about was Surah 7 verse 80, because if you're reading it cover to cover, this is going to be the one that you like see first, right? And so it says, "And remember when Lut scolded the men of his people, saying, 'Do you commit a shameful deed that no man has ever done before? You lust after men instead of women.'" This is obviously an English translation. I've got multiple different Qurans with different translations. Some of them say that nobody has done in the history of mankind, nobody has done in the world. And then it says here, lusting after men instead of women. We're going to break that down. We're also going to go back and take a look at Surah 15, 67 through 70, which talks a little more about that experience that happened there. So first of all, that verse right there says something that's really key here. And that's that Lut is saying, hey guys, like, you guys are doing something that's never been done before. And not only is Lut saying this, but the Quran is the direct word of Allah. And if you believe that to be true, which as Muslims we do, right? We know that Allah knows everything. Allah knows all people of all times, all history of the world and the universe. Allah knows all. So why does he specifically say here that the things his people are doing that is being condemned is something that no people have ever done before? Is it because Lut's people were the first people to have homosexual tendencies? Like, what is going on here? From the Smithsonian, Homo sapiens, which is our current type of humans, right, have been around for 300,000 years. According to the Armstrong Institute of Biblical Archaeology, this puts Abraham no further back than about 2000 BC. So that's like 4,000 years ago-ish. Wait a second. So people have been around for 300,000 years. Abraham was only 4,000 years ago. According to the American Psychological Association, most historians agree that homosexuality has been found in every documented culture in the world. One of the oldest examples is from 9600 BC. This is going to be some rock art that was found in Sicily, Italy, which depicted male homosexual acts. This was nearly 8,000 years before Abraham. Thousands of years, there's documented human homosexuality around the world. So if Allah, who knows all humans, knows everybody in the world, right, says that this is something that nobody has ever done before, no men have ever done before, then logically speaking, there's actually no way that it could be talking about blanketly homosexual acts. That across the board cannot actually be what's being talked about here, because Lut's people are doing something that people hadn't done before. That is super shameful. And it does involve homosexual acts, and we're about to get to that, but it's not blanket across the board homosexuality. It can't be. Because Allah knows that that's been around for thousands of years. So God knows that this has been going on for about 10,000 years before the Prophet Lut. So what specific context now? What is the context? What homosexual act specifically are we talking about? What is it? It can't, again, we proved logically it can't be homosexuality if we know that God knows that that's just been a thing. So what is it? One of the questions that I've often found myself asking Muslims that want to talk about this topic and bring it up is I will ask, okay, well, were these kind, generous, average men who just happened to be married to other men or who were having these secret sexual relationships with other men in private, but that God was just so against what they were doing that he forgot all of the good deeds they ever did and destroyed them because it's just that bad? Is that what happened? Not even close to that. That is what you're taking if you take like a modern context of like a gay couple, right? I'm going to read a section here of Stories of the Prophets. I do want to put a trigger warning on this because it does include SA. So if you are triggered by violence, sexual violence, and things like that, you're probably not going to want to watch this part. Maybe skip it. Or just take it slow as we talk about it, okay? So the Prophet Lut was with a group of friends who were actually angels in disguise, right? And the people of the town had found out that they were there, and they had a very aggressive way of treating outsiders, and it was not good. Quote, when Lot saw the mob approaching his house, this is a mob of guys, okay? He shut the door and they kept on banging on it. He pleaded with them to leave the visitors alone and fear Allah's punishment. He urged them to seek sexual fulfillment with their wives, for that is what Allah had made lawful. Lot's people waited until he had finished his short sermon, and then they roared with laughter. Blinded by passion, they broke down the door. Lot became very angry, but he stood powerless before these violent people. He was unable to prevent the abuse of his guests, but he firmly stood his ground and continued to plead with the mob. What is the context here? Consensual, private, or public? So the context in the story of Lut is actually public. There are large groups of people. It is non-consensual, and not just non-consensual. This isn't coercion. This is violence. This is breaking down a door to come attack people against their will. This actual form of weaponized homosexuality and rape isn't seen very much through history. This isn't common among soldiers. While homosexuality and consensual sorts of relationships between men is a part of human history since the beginning, and all of our archaeological information, this is not common. This is not something that you find a lot of information on at all. It's common to see soldiers or men in a tribe against another tribe go after the women. Rape and pillage and all of that is actually very, very common around the world. So this isn't like your gay neighbors next door. That's not what's happening. This is a mob that's coming in, violent, to take power and control over visitors because they're not from there. And this is what they do. The next thing we need to ask ourselves is that a lot of people say, but yeah, it says like they need to go to their wives. It's talking about sex. It's talking about sex because it brings up their wives. It brings up women. Surah 15, 67 through 70 says, indeed, these are my guests. Do not embarrass me. Okay, embarrassing. Again, this is about putting others down. This is a power play. This is about just, making people feel lesser than and awful and traumatizing them. He later says, oh, my people, here are my daughters, so marry them. Daughters means just like people of his tribe, people of his group, people of his town that are women of marrying age. Now we have to ask ourselves, if these men are violent, why is he saying it's okay to do this over here, but it's not okay to do this over here? But again, we have to contextualize this. It's actually because of the mindset of the people during biblical time. United States, for example, marital or spousal rape wasn't made illegal until 1993. It's like 30 years ago. 30 years ago. Remember that the Quran and the stories of the prophets are from 1400 plus years ago, 2000, 4000, whatever, years ago, or when these stories are happening. We are just now doing research into psychology, understanding the deeper psychological and emotional trauma that surrounds rape, including spousal rape. There are still parts of the world that don't have laws against it too, right? And women at the time, were considered spoils of war. That's not an uncommon thought. That's a very common, normal experience for the people back then. So if guys take over your town, they pass out the women. So the idea of guys taking out a violent sexual urge on women, on their wives and or concubines or any other type of person is not that shocking to them. Now that we are opening up our minds to some of these things, that we've learned so much more, we've actually expanded God's wish to make this kind of act wrongful. We are actually starting to expand it to women as well, right? So this violent homosexual acts on people has actually been expanded nowadays to include women as well. This is the progressive thought on this. This is the progressive mindset on this. And we want to continue in that direction, right? We look at what, Lut's people did, and we're like, yes, as progressives, we're just like, yes, that is very, very wrong. And in fact, that should be wrong to do to anybody, right? Of course, that wasn't the way at the time, but we're in a different time now. We've learned so much more. We're continuing to learn. The more we learn about ourselves, the more we learn about other people, the more we learn about God. So we are going to continue with this series now that we have a basic progressive understanding of what was said, what is the story of Lut, and why that happened, how we can better understand queer Muslims, gay Muslims, trans Muslims as religious leaders, imams or sheikhs or whoever else, how they can support and better work with and counsel and understand queer Muslims. We're also going to break down some of these texts chapter by chapter. We're going to be going through the history of Islamic jurisprudence on these subjects, how they got to the laws that they are today, how they got to where they are in their mindsets today, and sort of like reinterpretation with our modern understanding and modern information on the subject on all of these as well. So I will have the list of these books in the comments. I will also have a link in the description to the Intersections of LGBTQ and Islam MPV's course on that. Make sure you go to mpvusa.org. And as always, if you are looking for a good place to put your zakat money, Muslims for Progressive Values is a nonprofit, and they are here in the world, and they work with the UN to help women, to help queer people in Muslim countries to have better care, to maintain their rights, or at least receive their rights in the world, and just continue to advocate for social justice and a socially just and progressive Islam in the world. So if you haven't seen those other videos, go check them out. Make sure you like and subscribe to this channel, and we have a very long journey ahead of us. I hope you are there with us to learn as we go about queer Muslims around the world.